Hello and welcome to session 6 of Doubting Climate Change, the role of public relations and media in creating doubt about the science behind climate change. In today's session, we're going to be looking at an overview of the history and science regarding anthropogenic climate change. Now, obviously, over the last 400 or so years, there have been many inflection points where human society, human history has changed by the adoption of new technologies. So we're not going to be covering everything, and to some extent I've cherry-picked the things that I want to use, the building blocks, if you will, of the narrative that I want to build around the things we're talking about today. So imagine, if you will, 400 or so years ago in a pre-industrial agricultural society. Human impact was very small, communities were small, the population density in communities was small, travel was very restricted, people tended to be born, to live, to work, to die, all in the same kind of area. So along came the Industrial Revolution, or a series of revolutions based around industrial and technological developments. And what we saw here was the rapid urbanization of society. So there was mass population movements from rural settings into industrialized areas, great increase in population density, a reliance on more and more energy to produce goods and services, to allow the development of urban centers, and also the reliance on extractive industries to produce the fuel for that energy. And concomitant with that was also an increase in the population size of industrialized countries. So moving forward from that, we have the invention, the development of railway travel. We see this in countries in Europe, and particularly in the United States. We see that what railway travel did was to open up huge untapped vistas to allow the transportation of people and goods and services over vast distances. So it opened up the country in a way that was previously impossible to do. So coupled with that, we also have, as people were working in factories in the industrialized world, we saw the rise of concerns about working conditions, about human welfare. So the introduction of unions fighting for workers' rights. And what happened there is they said that people had to have limited hours that they could work. And so maybe a 60-hour working week, something like that. And then people questioned about what they did with their time off. So because of the rise in transportation, rise in general, in the rise of the economic standards for a lot of people, the notion of leisure came into society in the mid-18th, late 18th century. And coupled with that notion of leisure, of having free time, where you didn't have anything you had to do to earn a living, nobody was demanding anything of you, there arose this notion of tourism at the same time. And what that meant is that people were traveling outside the urban centers in which they were living and working, and traveling to, in this case, you see Victorian people at the seaside. So this notion of traveling somewhere else to experience something other than where they were living. So as people started to tour more, to go on holiday more, it opened up vistas to new ideas about what the world looked like and how it was shaped, and the possibilities for understanding the world, and the rise in consciousness that the world wasn't just a city in which people were living and working. So this led to the development in the late 19th century of national parks here in the US and other designated areas where development was limited, where they were trying to maintain this notion of pristine wildernesses, if you will. And legislation was put in place to protect these places from human development, to keep them pristine, because people started to recognize the importance of nature, even if they didn't necessarily understand what they were trying to protect it for. So then we had the invention by Henry T. Ford of mass production of cars. And so what that meant is that it changed the notion of personal travel, and it changed it in a way that allowed remote areas in the countryside to start to be populated, because people didn't necessarily need trains anymore. They could use their cars. So it opened up the possibilities for human expansion into areas that were previously untouched by humanity. And as people started to travel more, it encouraged people to move industries into different places, but it also relied very heavily on the extractive industries. Fossil fuel, not only for the production of the cars, but also for the propulsion of the cars, the fuel to make the cars run. And people started to be aware of this notion of pollution. Obviously, they'd seen it in the factories in the 17th and 18th centuries, but also now we're starting to see it on a personal scale. And in congested city centres, people started to be aware of smog and pollution from human activity. Then we move into the Second World War, and this notion of the atomic bomb, the Fat Man, the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima, the similar one on Nagasaki, and you see the resulting thing here. So this was a notion of the power to destroy ourselves. And for the first time in human history, people realized that such was our advancements in science and technology that we could actually destroy the planet on which we're living in a way that warfare never did before. It was always limited in scale, but now, mid-20th century, power to destroy ourselves was very present. That led into the Cold War, 1950s, 1960s, the Cold War, which was really a war between two competing ideologies, if you will. You had capitalism on one side and you had communism on the other side. And they were competing for supremacy in the world. Capitalism, which ended up being the dominant force, was heavily reliant on fossil fuel extraction to provide the energy for which the growth on which capitalism is predicated could happen. Growth in terms of population developments, in terms of industrial outputs, all of the metrics that make capitalism successful. So coupled with that, this ideological warfare between the East and the West, and the availability and the increase in ownership of nuclear warheads led to a notion of mutually assured destruction. So if America waged a war on Russia, Russia waged war on America, the notion was that given the propensity or the proliferation of nuclear weapons, that we would end up destroying everything in the planet. So again, this notion that humans can have a global impact on the one planet that we have. So things calmed down a little bit in the Cold War, but then America went to war and intervened in the Vietnam War in the 60s and to the 70s. And coupled with that, they had this a product called Agent Orange, which was chemical warfare using a pesticide that was designed to kill the vegetation, to defoliate all of the plants it touched. So here we had a notion of a government-sponsored chemicals to destroy the means of a population creating or generating, growing enough food for itself. They were trying to starve the people into submission by the application of this. So again, we're seeing the relationship between chemicals that had been originally designed, if you will, as fertilizers to increase the production that's needed of food that's needed to feed a growing population, to increase the productivity of farms. We're seeing the similar kind of chemical industries, but being used for destructive forces. So again, it's planting the seed in people's minds that chemicals can be used for negative things as well as positive things. And in 1962, Rachel Carson published her book, Silent Spring, which looked at the impact that human industries were having on the environment and the changes that were being wrought, not just in the soil, not just in the atmosphere, but in the rivers, in every single aspect of the environment. And she was very critical of the role of the chemical industries in doing so. And she said that chemical industries were using misinformation tactics to lie to the population about the impact of these chemicals and the long-term impact of chemicals, and that government was complicit in this activity. So she was one of the first people to really start to think about information, misinformation, some of the tools that are being used by the tobacco industry and now with extractive oil companies. Coming out at the same time, we had this notion of counterculture, which you can see here, the psychedelically painted bus. This is symbolic of hippie culture, and hippie culture was all about community, caring for each other and caring for the environment and being at one with the environment. So this notion of building smaller communities away from large cities. So this was happening at the same time. It's quite a powerful movement that led into all sorts of other things that are interesting. Similar at the same time, you had Apollo 8, the Apollo series of rockets that were taking people into Earth orbit and then to the moon. And this is a seminal photograph that was taken from Apollo 8 of the Earth spinning in space with nothing else around it. And this is quite a powerful image that had a big impact, believe it or not, in the late 1970s, because it showed the Earth small, fragile, and alone. So we could see all of humanity living on this small little globe in the middle of nothingness. And that had a big impact on people in the way that they started to think about the world, about their society within the world. We have on the right here a picture of a guy called Stuart Brand, who came out of the counterculture that I talked about earlier, and he came up with this notion of the whole Earth catalogue. And in effect, what it was the pre-internet internet. And he created this catalogue of all of the things that people would need in a society that was collapsing, but where self-sufficiency was the important way to survive. So he traveled around the United States with this catalogue, getting orders from people for a complete range of products, from things to help them with agriculture, but small-scale agriculture, not commercial farming, books about nascent technologies like the internet, computers, this kind of thing, because he envisaged the sustainable society of the future having access to tools that allowed us to become self-sufficient. And in and of itself, it was quite interesting, but when we see what it led to, the whole counterculture led to technologies that led to the internet that we have today. So it's quite a pivotal moment, but quite important at the same time. This is an author, a scholar, Fritjof Capra, who wrote a book called The Web of Life. And what this was, one of the first articulations was of the interrelatedness of different systems in society, about how one system is dependent upon another system in an eco-culture. So it's building on the ideas that Rachel Carson was talking about in Silent Spring, that nothing exists in isolation. But he articulated it in a particular way about understanding living systems and how if you impact one in a small way in one part of the world, it can have a much bigger impact in another part of the world. So the way that we see ecosystems and biosystems working today. So out of this awareness of we have one planet, the fact that we have the capability to destroy ourselves, that we have chemicals that can be used for good and for bad, there were movements that grew up around the world in terms of trying to make us aware, make governments aware of what we have to do to protect our planet. So Greenpeace was one of the most visible of these organizations that contributed to this movement. And again, it's quite powerful at thinking about the world that we're living in and how to protect it. In the 1980s, one of the biggest crises that we encountered from a climate point of view was the realization of the fact that chemicals that we were using in our daily lives were destroying the ozone layer. And that led to people panicking about getting skin cancer because the ozone filtered out some of the ultraviolet rays in the environment. So people in the Antipodes, in Australia and New Zealand were particularly concerned because the ozone layer hole was occurring over that part of the planet. And so in 1987, there was a meeting in Montreal that came out with the Montreal Protocol that was advancing climate actions to protect the ozone layer. And again, this was the first time that countries, nation states worked together in a way to try to protect the environment, to try to protect the planet that we're living on. I'm putting here a slide that has some of the most important developments in climate science, and the first time that people started talking about the influence of human activities on climate. We see that back in 1896 was one of the first scientific papers talking about the impact and the influence of a byproduct of an industrial process on the atmosphere and the temperature on the ground. So this relationship between the pollutants that we're putting into the atmosphere and the temperature of the planet. Right the way through to what I talked about in session 3 or session 4, Naomi Oreskes doing this scientific consensus on climate change. So then in 2007, there was an intergovernmental panel on climate change that looked, it kind of combined a lot of these different areas of thinking and understanding about how humans are impacting the systems of the Earth that are beginning to make the Earth uninhabitable for us in terms of climate change. And we went through stages of calling it global warming, but because we didn't understand the science particularly well, but then it developed into climate change because as parts of the planet are getting hotter, other parts are getting cooler. So again, that was one of the things that the people fighting against doing anything about climate change latched onto when we talked about global warming, is the fact that some parts of the world are getting colder. So the nomenclature around the science had to change to be able to embrace exactly what was happening, to take away or to remove the opportunity of naysayers trying to undermine the science at that particular point. So moving on, we look at the work of Naomi Oreskes in 2004, where just to recap, she did a meta-analysis of all of the scientific articles published by climate scientists looking at the human causes of global warming back then. Climate change, we call it now. And this is going from 2004 to 2015 and seeing that there's a strong consensus about the causation of global warming, of climate change. So then skipping forward, and many of you will recognize the girl in the image here. It's Greta Thunberg, and she very famously went on a school strike. She refused to go to school because she was saying the notion was that she didn't want to sit in school while the politicians of the world are destroying her future. And so she became very well known for this, started a movement, and she was invited to a lot of different government activities around the world to talk about her perspective, and she became a voice for young people on the planet, an unelected voice. She had no aspiration for politics. She was just talking what she saw as common sense. And the backlash against her was quite interesting in terms of this is from Youth Vogue, Teen Vogue magazine, where they were saying that the attacks in the media on Greta Thunberg came from a coordinated network of climate change deniers. When you do a brief analysis of Twitter, as it was called then, X as it is now, you can see various posts. And the first one I put up here is by a man who is he's a UK businessman, and he's a donor to the Conservative Party. He's a climate change denier. And he's referencing here a point that Greta Thunberg, living in Europe, was invited to the United Nations in 2019 to give a talk about her perspective, about youth perspective. And his tweet said, freak yachting accidents do happen in August. So this was seen as, because she'd chosen not to fly to the United Nations, she went on a sailboat. So it was presaging, it's maybe attacking a little bit her mode of travel and maybe suggesting that she could die in the process of going there because she wasn't smart enough to get on a plane or whatever. So then there was a series of attacks, a lot of attacks. Again, I'm cherry picking here. This is from a US lobbyist and a climate denier who's talking about how her discourse is unhinged. And then we have somebody who you might know who is, I put him here as a reality TV personality and climate denier, saying that he's being sarcastic and sardonic in the way that he's writing about Greta Thunberg. Donald Trump is a big climate denier. And then finally, from a Canadian perspective, this is what Maxime Bernier had to say about her. And he said she's clearly mentally unstable, not only autistic, but obsessive compulsive, eating disorder, depression and lethargy, and she lives in a constant state of fear. She wants us to feel the same. I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear I fear every day, which is what she was saying about the impending damage to the earth caused by climate change. So what we're seeing here is, again, the end of a timeline, or coming to the end of a timeline, And we're seeing the tactics that were created and put into the tobacco playbook, which we talked about in the last session, being used here to undermine a youth voice who's talking about their concerns and anxieties of growing up in a world where governments are doing absolutely nothing to try to reverse human impact on climate change. So in that being said, thank you for watching this session, and I look forward to our next session.